I'm George Curtis. Welcome to It's Your Law, and we're talking about firearms in Wisconsin, which is a very important subject to many of us and a very controversial one. We've heard from Ray Edelstein, and he's kind of posed the problem, and it's a very personal, individual problem of good people who've been in very little trouble, in most instances, get an unexpected answer, and the answer they're not looking for, when later on in life they want to purchase a gun or possess a gun or go hunting. Our next guest is Christian Gossett. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Besides being district attorney of Winnebago County, you previously were in law enforcement as a police officer.
That's correct.
So you're familiar with guns, not only physically, but a little bit about the rules of guns.
Correct.
How important are guns in what you're doing now, that is enforcing the laws of Winnebago County?
As far as being able to enforce the laws, well, certainly we give guns to all of our police officers.
You train them to use the gun?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's important to know who out there that might have a criminal record might be carrying a gun?
Very much so.
But of course, it'd be my impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that real criminals aren't going to register their guns, aren't going to turn their guns in, and so if we do compel everybody to turn their guns in, the people that we're worried about are the ones who will keep them.
I think that's a very good point, and that especially applies when you start talking about the concealed carry laws and things of that sort. The fear isn't the person who wouldn't have had the gun in the first place. The fear is the person who is already carrying the gun, despite the fact that there's no law that allows it.
Well, the Second Amendment says, basically, and the way it's written, it's been debated now for a couple of hundred years, that citizens have the right to possess firearms, their own private firearms, although there's a school of thought that says it isn't a private right, it deals with the militia, and it's a public right, and that's been debated for a couple of hundred years. But in either event, there's some real limitations. Nobody seems to disagree that we have the right to limit firearm possession or ownership to felons, dangerous people, mentally ill people, people who are the subject of a restraining order because they have posed a threat to somebody else. Nobody seriously argues that the Constitution guarantees the right of your 2-year-old to use a firearm as a teething instrument in the
Right.
crib, that there are limitations that seem reasonable of age and passing hunter safety and that sort of thing. So would you agree with me, in spite of the NRA, it's not an absolute right?
I would agree with that. And to add to that list, also anybody with documented issues with drugs or alcohol, controlled substance issues.
But when we get into the situation that Ray was describing, many people who have no serious convictions, who probably are leading law-abiding lives, may find that some little incident when they were young or foolish or both can stop them. And what's the view of the district attorney's office when we bump into those situations?
Well, there's really only a couple circumstances where you can have your firearms, your right to possess firearms taken away. One is when we're talking about something at the level of a felony conviction. And that's any crime for which you can be imprisoned for 1 year or more. So we're talking about the most serious categories of crimes, first of all. Now, the reason I say it would be akin to a felony is because, of course, in the juvenile justice system, you're not charged with misdemeanor or felony cases. It's a completely different system, but if you were to commit something that would be a felony in the adult system, that would qualify for prohibition later in life. And the second type of offense is a domestic incident where violence was an issue. So we're talking about either the most serious of offenders, or we're talking about somebody in a domestic situation who has resorted to violence in the past.
Well, that domestic business is kind of fuzzy.
Right.
And it seems to me, from my distant memory of when I did that kind of work, often those things are very emotional, very stressful. It's hard to tell who's at fault, who's just stressed, and sometimes the individual say, okay, to save my family, to be able to see my kids, I'll go along with this. It isn't fair, it isn't what happened, but I'll go along with this, only to have it come back to haunt that individual years later.
That's possible, and it probably does happen. In fact, I shouldn't say possible. It's probable that that does happen on occasion. But don't forget, we have to have some element of violence involved in that domestic violence incident. So somebody has to hit another person or choke another person. And when something like that happens, as opposed to just simply an argument, now you have a dangerous situation. You have somebody who, not only is it an emotionally charged situation for both parties, but when it really started to get bad, somebody, either one of the parties involved, can have the prohibition. It can be the man or the woman, but somebody lashed out physically and violently against another person. The concern with firearms, of course, is firearms are a very quick way to bring about somebody else's death, and it's also a very impersonal way. So the fear is, of course, if they at one point in time grabbed somebody and choked them or punched somebody, if they had a firearm nearby, they could have just as easily grabbed them and shot them. And the number of domestic violence deaths, I think, does justify some of that. In fact, when I was going through the police academy, they always told us that if you get killed as a police officer, it's going to be one of two places: the routine traffic stop or the domestic violence call. And I think adding that emotionally charged element to a domestic situation really changes the dynamics.
Well, of course, let's say mom and dad come home from Friday night fish fry in Wisconsin, and they've each had a couple of beers, and they have an argument about what the bartender said and that sort of thing. And the argument has one of them pushing the other one, and the second one pushing the other one off. Either one could have scratches on their face. A kid is upset and calls the cops, and the cop didn't see it, so the cop has to make a knee-jerk judgment as to who gets carted away. For safety, somebody should get carted away. I submit it's usually the bigger, stronger male that gets carted away, because it would look to me, if I was a cop, that's the person who potentially could do the most damage. And yet it may have nothing to do with who started the fight or who really was at fault.
Yeah, and that is very possible. And now with the mandatory arrest law, we're seeing even more people being incarcerated out of domestic situations. We do what we can to try to sort that out once it gets to the district attorney's office. This past week, the Winnebago County Board actually approved reinstating a second domestic violence investigator within the district attorney's office. Actually, I should qualify that. It's a special investigator, but that person will be in addition to our current domestic violence investigator. So in Winnebago County, we take the extra step of having an investigator from the district attorney's office go back, re-interview the parties. And what we're looking for oftentimes when we're evaluating domestic violence cases is we're not just looking for a domestic incident, two people getting into an argument. We're looking at it for true domestic violence. Is there an issue with power and control? Power and control really defines domestic violence. And when we see those issues, we go after those people very aggressively. When we don't see those issues, then we'll back up just a little bit, and by changing the language in what's charged out, you can sometimes avoid those firearm prohibitions down the road. And that's something that most defense attorneys will ask us to do when they have a situation where there wasn't violence. It was just simply a disorderly conduct, screaming and yelling back and forth. If there isn't the allegation of violence, then the person should not be subject to the firearms prohibition later in life.
Obviously, you're aware of the ramifications of a domestic violence conviction. Do the courts tell the defendant before accepting a plea that this is a ramification?
Yes, yes.
Well, that's good to know. We appreciate you being on the show, and as always, giving us the prosecution point of view.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.